Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system. The customary quote: help your pieces so they can help you, from Paul Morphy. A brief review of the last part, where we completed chapter 4, The Two Bishops, part 2 of the book Position Play, after discussing the topics how the bishops fight a pawn mass and hem in enemy knights, and the two bishops in the endgame, with illustrations from Nimzowitsch. We also went through game number 41 of the illustrative game section as recommended by Nimzowitsch. So now, moving further in the book, we begin the next chapter, Overprotection, which is chapter 5 of the second part of the book, Position Play. Nimzowitsch begins the chapter with the topic number 1, why we should systematically overprotect our own strong points. Nimzowitsch writes, a short chapter which in particular may serve to illustrate the various forms under which overprotection can appear. In part 2 of the book, Position Play, first chapter and topic number 3, we have already attempted to explain the spirit and inner significance of overprotection. We will therefore only repeat here that the contact established between the strong point and the overprotector can only be of advantage to both parties. To the strong point, because the prophylactic induced by such a process affords it the greatest imaginable security against possible attack. To the overprotector, since the point serves them as a source of energy from which they may continually draw fresh strength. Overprotection clearly represents a maneuver which from its essence must have developed in close connection with position play. Nevertheless, even in the elements we came across traces of overprotection, for example in the open file. Consider the skeleton position on board. The outpost knight after knight c3 to d5 must, as was emphasized in part 1 of the book, the elements, second chapter and topic number 6, be protected not only by a pawn but also by a rook. What can this compulsion signify other than the necessity of overprotecting the strategically important outpost? Again, in the domain of the pawn chain, overprotection is a stratagem which deserves every preference. Turn to the game Nimzowitsch vs. Guys, part 2 of the book Position Play, first chapter and topic number 3, Position on Board. And notice in particular how the overprotection was not even intended for the base of the pawn chain. However awesome the respect this inspired in us, but rather for a more humble candidate for that position, for we overprotected the pawn at e5, since we had always to reckon with an eventual and inevitable d takes on c5, when the pawn at e5 would be promoted to be the base. The wonderful vitality of the overprotector may here be demonstrated by two further examples. Nimzowitsch vs. Rubinstein, Carlsbad, 1911. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, c3, knight c6, knight f3, queen b6, bishop d3, c takes on d4, c takes on d4, bishop d7, bishop e2, knight e7, b3, knight f5, and bishop b2. At the moment, the pawn at d4 is barely protected, not more. Bishop b4 check, king f1, h5, g3, rook c8, king g2, g6, h3 and bishop e7, intending to answer a possible g4 by knight h4 check. queen d2, a5, rook c1, bishop f8, queen d1, bishop h6, rook c3, castles, g4, knight e7 and knight a3. Only now will it be clear why white delayed with the development of this knight. An honorable post had been contemplated for the knight, namely as overprotector of the pawn at d4. Knight b4 and knight c2. There now follows a surprising and effortless unraveling of the skein or the tangle of white pieces on the queen's wing. Rook takes on c3, bishop takes on c3, knight takes on c2, queen takes on c2, rook c8, and queen b2. Whatever happens, the pawn at d4 shall stay overprotected. Bishop b5, bishop takes on b5, queen takes on b5, and bishop d2. The overprotector shows his teeth. Bishop f8, rook c1, h takes on g4, h takes on g4, rook c6, and queen a3. Overprotector number 2 won't take a back place to number 1. See the last note. Rook takes on c1, a pity. For on knight f5, white intended to offer a queen sacrifice. Rook takes on c6, bishop takes on a3, rook c8 check, king g7 and g takes on f5 with a strong attack. An excellent index to the inherent elasticity of an overprotector. So rook takes on c1 and queen takes on c1 with the superior game. Nimzowitsch versus Spielmann, Stockholm 1920. e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, knight f3, knight c6, c3, queen b6, bishop e2, c takes on d4, c takes on d4, knight h6, and knight c3. b3, as in the last example, is more prudent. So knight c3, knight f5, knight a4, queen a5 check, bishop b2, bishop d2, bishop b4, bishop c3, and bishop d7. Preferable would have been bishop takes on c3 check, knight takes on c3, and queen b4. If queen b6, then knight a4. So queen b4, bishop b5, castles, bishop takes on c6, queen takes on b2, knight a4, queen b4 check, and queen d2. White would then have the point c5, black a backward pawn plus. But bishop d7 was played in the game and play continued with a3, bishop takes on c3 check, knight takes on c3, h5, castles, rook c8, queen d2, and queen d8, threatening g5, h3, in order to parry g5 by the riposte or clever reply g4. For example, g5, g4, h takes on g4, h takes on g4, knight h4, knight takes on h4, rook takes on h4, and king g2, followed by rook h1 with advantage to white. Knight a5, however, was played in the game. Rook d1, queen b6, and rook e1. The pawn at d4 and to a certain degree the pawn at e5 are now systematically overprotected, and this strategy makes it possible later to be automatically, so to speak, master of the situation, whatever complications may arise. Knight c4, bishop takes on c4, rook takes on c4, knight e2, bishop a4, and rook c1. Notice how available the overprotector is for service in all directions. For example, the rook at d1 at c1 and the knight at g3. Bishop b3, rook takes on c4, bishop takes on c4, knight g3, knight e7, and white stands rather the better. He won the game on the 61st move. See Die Blockade, page number 69. So much on the overprotection of the base. The overprotection of the following points is also of importance. A. Overprotection of the central points. We have already on a previous opportunity emphasized the fact that the very common neglect of the central theatre of war is reprehensible. What we have here to do rather with the detail, or more accurately with the examination of a quite definite and for the hypermodern style of play, typical situation. As is generally known, the hypermodern knows admirably how to resist the temptation to occupy the center with pawns, at any rate not until a really favorable opportunity presents itself. If such offers, the hypermodern casts aside all shyness, and the pawns, supported by the fianchettoed bishops, rush wildly forward, seize the center, and strive to crush the enemy. Against this threatened evil, the overprotection of certain central points provides a thoroughly proven remedy which cannot be too strongly recommended. Let us glance at the following opening of the game, Retty vs. Yates, New York, 1924. Knight f3, d5, c4, e6, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, bishop d6, b3, and castles. Why this hurry? To put the center in order was much more pressing. Therefore, c6, knight d7, and e5 was his proper line. So castles, rook e8, bishop b2, knight d7, d3 question mark, c6, knight d2, and e5. The position now reached is undoubtedly more favorable for black. White ought to have played d4 instead of d3. C takes on d5, c takes on d5, rook c1, knight f8, rook c2, bishop d7, queen a1, knight g6, and rook c1. White's queen maneuver is significant. He intends to undermine the enemy center by d4 when opportunity offers, and if black reply e4, then knight e5. Hence, black's duty is to overprotect his pawn at e5 even to excess. His best course was first b5, aiming at white's queen's wing, which is compromised by the position of his queen. If then knight f1, there would follow queen b8 equals to overprotection of e5. Knight e3, a5, and black has the better game. This line of play, which I pointed out in Kagan's Neueste Schachnachrichten 1924, met at the time with little approbation or approval. Nowadays, things are different. For a game which took a most interesting course and in which I employed the same queen maneuver, queen b8, with the same idea as that indicated above, see game number 38 of the illustrative game section. Please note that we shall go through this game towards the end of the video series along with any other remaining games from the illustrative game section of the book. Nimzowitsch continues. B. The overprotection of the center as a measure of defense for our own king's wing. The case which is about to be discussed in detail differs from that considered above under point A in its general tendency and is therefore treated here as an independent maneuver, not as a subdivision of that case. In part 2 of the book, chapter 1, topic number 6, in the position on board, a position was discussed which comes under the classification of the case now to be considered. Game number 15 of the illustrative game section is also instructive in the same sense. Please note that this game has already been covered in part 27 of the video series. Nimzowitsch continues. In this game, after the 13th move, a position was reached which is shown on board. Black's last move was g4. To the reply h takes on g4, h takes on g4 and queen takes on g4, he had planned rook takes on h2, followed by bishop takes on e5 check and bishop takes on b2. White, however, played rook e1, and in doing something for his center, he at the same time strengthened the power of resistance of his position against flank attacks as well. There followed king f8 and knight c3, the prelude to a blockading maneuver. Queen e7, bishop takes on f5, e takes on f5, queen e3, rook h6, knight e2, c5, knight f4, and white has the better game. For the two bishops have little to say in view of the unassailable knight. Moreover, the collective mobility of black is quite small, for though the pawns at c5 and d5 have a certain measure of mobility, the rest are blockaded. Of quite special interest in the same sense is the position shown on board, which is taken from game number 39 of the illustrative game section. It was black's move. That the knight at d5 was the pride of black's position is beyond all doubt. It was, however, not easy to devise a suitable plan. White was preparing one, though it is true it presented no great danger, namely queen d2 followed by knight to e1, to d3, to c5. The train of thought which I followed in the game brought me on the track of a hidden maneuver which to this day I consider a good one. The separate links in this chain of ideas are these. Number 1. The knight at d5 is strong. Therefore, number 2, the overprotectors, the queen at d7 and rook at d8 are also strong. But number 3, The rook at d8 has a duty in connection with the king's position, which has a bearing on the rook's strength in the center. Therefore, number 4, the king's rook must come to d8. Accordingly, there followed king b8, queen d2, rook c8, knight e1, bishop e7, knight d3, and rook d8. The deed is done. The rook at d8 now feels that they can devote their whole attention to the center, since their colleague at c8 is looking after the king. The further adventures of the rook at d8 will be found in game number 39. Please note, we shall go through this game in its entirety towards the end of this chapter. Nimzowitsch continues. We could name many more points that are worthy of overprotection, but will limit ourselves to the few examples we have here given. Before, however, passing on to the next strategical device, we must once more stress the fact that only strategically valuable points should be overprotected, not a sickly pawn, nor a king's wing which rests on a weak foundation. Overprotection must in no sense be regarded as an act of Christian meekness and loving kindness. The pieces overprotect a point because they promise themselves strategical advantages to be gained from contact with it. We must therefore seek to establish connection with strong points. A weak pawn is only in a single exceptional case justified in claiming overprotection, and that is when the pawn is engaged in looking after a potential giant of their species. For instance, white pawns d4 and e5, black pawns d5 and e6. The pawn at d4 as the base of white's pawn chain is to nurse the strategically important pawn at e5, so that the overprotection of the pawn at d4 seems indicated. Alright, we conclude this part of Aron Nimzowitsch, my system here, and we shall continue onwards from the next one. Here is a look at the recent channel support from my Twitch stream. Several new supporters: Probum, fatgamerd, and DMnoGM. Thank you for the kind support, everyone. Much appreciated. Alright, till next time, take care.